Yeah, it's cool. Well, it's probably 74. See, that one's on 55 for heat. I don't understand why it was on heat. Because I went out to change the filters out in the back, and both fans were running. And the compressors weren't running. Right. The fans were running, the heat strips. Or not heat strips, but the heat pumps. Heat pump. And I'm just going, well, why that shouldn't be running? No. I made a change on this one, reprogrammed it, went out there 30 minutes later.
That one's 73 auto. That's exactly back where it's supposed to. You know what? That one said cool. Maybe it ought to be on all of them.
Yeah, they should be.
Yeah, I'm gonna go check that one.
Like these we don't, because people trying.
Good morning. We're about to start our Sunday morning Bible class. This morning, we're going to continue our lessons on the influence of a woman, and we'll be talking about Naomi and Ruth this morning. The lesson sheets are in the back. If you don't have one, you might want to grab one. And then Amy pointed out that the ones for next week, I didn't find them back there on the table, so we'll try to make sure we get those put out this afternoon. So if you're here tonight, you can grab one. It's going to be on Michal, David's first wife, next week. But today we're back to the period of the Judges, which is where we find the story of Ruth occurring. So our text is all the book of Ruth, but really the first two chapters, really the first three chapters of Ruth. It's a really enjoyable read. I'm sure you had a chance this week to do that. So we're going to, again, go through kind of some of the events in the story before we start talking about how it relates to influence. If you've got the lesson sheet handy, there's 2 pages, or it's a front and back, and there's 2 columns for both Naomi and Ruth. If you'll take the page for Naomi, and over the first column put a 1, we're going to do that column first. Next to it, a 3 over the second column on Naomi's page. And on Ruth's page, you can put a 2 over the first column and a 4 over the second column. And maybe that way I won't get distracted and confused about what I'm going to cover next, and y'all can remind me. We're going to do them in that order. So like I said, the story of Ruth occurs during the period of the Judges. We don't know the exact date or who the contemporaries are in this story, but we do know a little bit about the timeline, because one of the main characters here is Boaz, who is the son of, drawing a blank here, we talked about it a couple weeks ago, Rahab from the story of Jericho. So, it's not been a couple generations since that's occurred. According to chapter 1, there is a famine in the area of Bethlehem, which is where the characters start this story. A man named Elimelech is the father in this story. Naomi is his wife, and they have 2 sons. And they leave Bethlehem, and travel to Moab because of the famine. And it seems they take with them all that they own. And once they get to Moab, Elimelech dies. So it's now just Naomi and her 2 sons. The sons marry 2 women from Moab, and then both sons die. So that leaves Naomi as a widow, and her 2 daughter-in-laws stay with her. At some point, Naomi learns that the famine in Judah has ended, and she wants to go back home to her people. She tries to send Orpah and Ruth back home to their families before she leaves to go back to Bethlehem, but these 2 daughter-in-laws are reluctant to leave her. And so let's read a portion of this, Ruth chapter 1. We'll start in verse 8. Ruth 1, verse 8. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, but we will surely return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said, I have hope, If I should even have a husband tonight and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother in law, but Ruth clung to her. Okay, so once again, we don't have the full story here. This is not a novel that explains all that occurred between Naomi and her daughter in laws. But clearly, there's been a connection made here. How long it's been that they've been with her, why they stayed to this point, what events happened that brought this closeness about, we don't know anything about. But it's clear that both of these women are very much attached to Naomi. So one of them goes back, and she does, with the encouragement of Naomi, she does return to her family, but Ruth continues, and let's read that from 15 to 18. And then she said, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. For your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts me and you. When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. Okay, so Ruth is determined to stay with Naomi through everything, and she's totally prepared to leave her family, to leave her country, and to make a change in where she lives, how she lives, who she's going to consider her people, and she says who's going to be her God. So this is total commitment. And we typically we see these words maybe at a wedding ceremony. We read these scriptures because this attachment is what you would, it's all you'd hope for in a married couple, that they'd have that kind of commitment. And here we see the commitment in the daughter-in-law and the mother-in-law. So that really is the first column we're going to talk about this morning on the page for Naomi and Ruth. It's the verses we just read, 8 through 18, where Naomi is trying to convince her daughters-in-law to return back to their families. So what we have here, well, let me just ask this. What did Naomi want for her daughters-in-law? What is she trying to convince them to do? To go home to their families. Is she successful in her appeals to Ruth to do that? She's not. So this is just another example of a mother-in-law not having sufficient influence on her daughter-in-law. Julie?
I think she had so much influence on her mother-in-law that her daughter-in-law had decided to become Jew.
Okay. Yeah, it's not that she failed in having influence. She did have so much influence that at this point her words don't mean as much as her actions and what she meant to Ruth. So really, in this instance, she's not able to convince her daughter-in-law, to do what she wants. But it's almost as if there's just too much influence here to convince Ruth to do what's in her own best interest. Because from a worldly perspective, what options does Ruth have here at this point? Well, but she had a few. And so one of them was, as Naomi was saying, go to your family and stay with them. That was an option. She can just go back to her parents and live in their house. That was one option. Option two was to go back and take a new husband, which is also what Naomi is trying to convince her to do. She should have got married to somebody else. And the third option was to go with this old woman who had no prospects for anything better coming along. It was going to be a poverty-stricken life. if she went back with Naomi, and that's what she chose. So that says a lot about the influence that Naomi had on her. Was that a deficiency in Orpah that she went home? Some kind of selfishness? No, she had the same reaction initially. She had a very similar attachment to Naomi, but she eventually was willing to go home. And yeah, okay, Glenn.
Naomi's speech to her daughters as much about trying to influence them to go away. I think it was more officially releasing them of any duty they
Right.
had to help her.
Right.
Saying, you can, don't worry about it, go back and you can start over.
Giving them permission to go about their lives and not be stuck with Naomi. And she alludes in this talk she has about how kind they have been already to her and to her sons in death. I mean, they've done things everything you could have asked of them. And she is essentially saying, you don't have to worry about me. Y'all go on and have your lives. Okay, so the first column there, what's the relationship between the influenced individual? We're talking about Naomi and Ruth here. Simply mother-in-law, daughter-in-law. Was it long-term or short-term? Long-term. Overall result for Ruth here, positive or negative? It's going to be positive. It doesn't necessarily look at the start like this is a wise choice. Obviously, she's been influenced to the point where she doesn't care about her anymore. She's looking out for Naomi. What was the method of influence? How did it come about that Naomi had so much influence over these two young women? Ricardo? Okay. Okay. Uh-huh. Yeah, and clearly it's not given to us exactly how she came to be this influential, but it had to have been based on her actions as a mother-in-law, as a mother, as a spiritual person, all those things. She was willing to, she was able to influence through that lifestyle. Julie?
The whole situation with Naomi and God was always been somewhat troubling because, of course, they moved to Moab, which was a Gentile nation, to escape a famine. But then her sons married outside of God.
Was that okay? No, yeah. Yeah.
But evidently, it wasn't. Naomi didn't take it out on them.
Right.
I mean, she treated them as if they were
Her dog. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and some commentators will say, well, the reason they died was because they had disobeyed God, and God's punishing these two young men. We don't really know that. That's someone speculating. But yeah, they weren't to marry foreign women, and they did. And whatever that was like in their household, if Naomi tried to convince them otherwise, we don't know. But she certainly took these two girls as her own.
And I don't think anything that God does is by accident. I mean, obviously, Ruth ends up in the lineage of Christ. Just like with Joseph and Egypt.
Right. And God is going to use all these people's individual decisions, right or wrong, to further his will. That's right. Okay. What is the impact of the influence? What is Ruth? How is she changing her destiny by making this decision to stay with Naomi? Yeah, eventually she'll be in the lineage of Christ, but immediately, what is she deciding to do here? She's leaving her family behind, leaving her people. All the customs and stuff she knows, she's leaving. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, she's really committing to a life of poverty here.
They were fully into, but they were aware of and probably participated in a lot of the activities surrounding.
Okay, so that's possible. I mean, we don't know that from the passages, but it's possible that she had already been a proselyte before she married or after she married Naomi's son. It's possible. We do know that this commitment she makes here is to serve God. And it's maybe one of those, hold on a second, Grant. It may be one of those times where people are initially brought to God because of the influence of those around them more than God's word itself, until you get that opportunity to then share God's word because of the influence of another Christian, which happens sometimes. And that may be what's happening here. Grant?
I think her decision to do this stands out so big to people today, because it's the opposite of what we're dealing with.
Yep.
Another law I've got to protect myself. I've got to make sure that I provide for.
Right.
She chose loving her mother-in-law, loving basically what Christ would have us to be like.
Yep.
Over everything that the world places upon our part.
Yeah, it really is striking when you consider the choice she made here wasn't for self, it was for somebody else. Okay. Was the influence a result of a conscious effort? So some say yes. I mean, did Naomi set out to convince? I mean, you can answer this question a bunch of different ways, but because when I read it, I don't get the sense that she was setting up Ruth to make this decision all along. It just happened because of how Naomi lived her life and the kind of person she was. She was influencing people without even really trying to. It's just who she was. And I ask this question every week. It's part of the chart we used, and it's almost always, was the influence a result of a conscious effort? Yes. And it seems kind of silly to ask, but today, a couple times, I think we're going to see where they're influencing people without even really trying to. Here, she's consciously trying to convince her to stay home, and yet because she was so influential through just her lifestyle, she couldn't do that. Was it part of a larger pattern, the influence here? Yeah. Right. Yeah, I think this influence. Mm-hmm. Yep. And we're going to get to that. That's also a really strange twist in the story. But I think this influence had been growing between Naomi and Ruth to the point now we're at this level where it's just so powerful. Was Ruth aware of the effort to influence? Yeah, it depends on, yes, in the fact that she knew Naomi was trying to convince her to do something. She wouldn't do what Naomi asked her to here, but she was aware of the effort. She wasn't aware possibly about how much Naomi was beginning to be influential in her life just through her own lifestyle. Would Ruth have been better off or worse off without the influence? If Naomi wasn't in her life, would she have been better off? Clearly not spiritually. I mean, this is going to pay off for Ruth dramatically. So the influence Naomi has is going to be very positive here. Some speculation again. What would have been this result without the influence? She married this Jewish man, and he dies, and the mother-in-law is not really very influential. What would have happened to Ruth? Yeah, she would have probably just stayed in Moab and either stayed at home or remarried, but it would have been a very different story. It turns out that Naomi played a huge role. So, what kind of takeaways do we get from this one instance here? What are some things, some lessons learned that we can take away?
Naomi makes perfect example of like
Okay. An example of the power of just living a godly life and the influence that we can get from that. That's really big. Okay. At some point, it gets to be that our lifestyle speaks a lot louder than our words. And that could be for good or for bad. Here, Naomi is trying to convince her daughter to return home. And because her influence is so powerful, she can't do that, which is interesting. Usually it works the other way around, where we're trying to have a positive influence on somebody to get them to do something we want them to do. And because our actions have been so ungodly, then they're not going to listen to us. Well, this is the opposite. So it works both ways. One of the discussion questions for this portion is, what did Ruth give up in order to stay with Naomi? Was it a wise choice, humanly speaking?
she got this ability of family because once they get back to Israel, they had no idea what was going to happen when they got there.
Right? Yes. Giving up her family is a big thing, and Ruth is willing to do that. She does that.
One of the biggest things for many times
Children, yes. What was this whole talk where Naomi is talking about, are you going to wait for me to have kids and give you another son? Are you going to wait for these sons to grow up? Why was that part of this discussion? Yeah.
Jewish law was that brother, the widow
Right.
of their dead brothers.
Right. And so that's what she's talking about here, this whole custom that it had, where if the husband dies, then the next brother in line takes the wife, and then that child is born to the first husband. And it wasn't just, so it's the family and having children, but also the inheritance that went along with that. And it's very complicated how the Jews passed on their possessions, their property. But this is all at stake right here. And she said, I have no prospects of giving you a son. I'm an old woman. I can't have kids. And even if I did have a kid, it'd be too long. So she's really given up, as far as she knows, a family here as well. Julie?
Well, and being from Moab, for Ruth to go back to Israel, in no way assures her of being able to have a husband.
That's right. Yeah. In fact, it's probably too much to hope for to get a Jewish husband at this point. Yeah. So she's given up quite a bit. All right, let's keep moving because we're going to run out of time again. I keep running out of time on these. Let's go over to the page where it's Ruth and Boaz. And this is the first column there, which I've asked you to put a 2. And it's chapter 2, 5 through 16. Once Naomi and Ruth return back to Bethlehem, they don't have a lot of prospects for supporting themselves. So Ruth just jumps right in at what she can do, which is gleaning in the field. What is gleaning about? What's that? Harvesting, but she's not a harvester in the sense that she has any land. So like Julie says, this is just leftovers. When the harvesters go through, and it's everything, of course, at this time was done by hand, you can't pick everything. And so as they gather and they put the sheaves together, and the sheaves get put together into shocks, and there's a whole process for doing this, stuff gets left behind. And the poor were allowed to go, and you had to be careful when you did this. You don't want to get accused of stealing. If you went behind the harvesters, you could pick up the leftovers. And it wasn't anything that was going to give you any kind of amount to sell and start making a profit. This is just subsistence, day to day.
There was a law that was enforced that they had to leave the corners
Uh-huh.
for the needy.
Right. So God had made provision for the poor, but the poor had to work get this benefit. And the Jewish people wouldn't always follow this law. Some of the landowners were very greedy and didn't want any gleaners in their property, and they could abuse them and run them off. And they could also not leave the corners. So there's a lot that's required by God, but not necessarily followed by the landowners. So what happens is Ruth ends up in the field of Boaz. And Boaz, we find out, is rich and influential. And she's in his field. And he comes to check on things, and he sees this woman who's amongst his harvesters, and he doesn't know her, so he asks who she is. So I want to read some of this before we go into the questions. And so let me start in chapter 2. I think verse 5 is the start. When Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant in charge of the reapers answered and said, "She is the young Moabite woman whom returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." And she said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." Thus she came and has remained from the morning till now. She has been sitting in the house for a little while. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen carefully, my daughter. Do not go glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go on from this one, but stay here with my maids. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars and drink from what the servants draw." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" And Boaz answered and said to her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and came to a people that you did not previously know. May the Lord reward your work, and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. And then she said, "I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants." Let's see, and then a couple more verses. And then in the meantime, Boaz said to her, "Come here, that you may eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar." So she sat beside the reapers, and he served her roasted grain, and she ate and was satisfied, and had some left. When she rose to glean, Boaz commanded his servants, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not insult her. And also you shall purposely pull out for her some grain from the bundles, and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her." Okay, and so he has heard about her already, and he is being very generous in the way he's treating Ruth. You think this is typical for how he treats those who glean in his fields? Why not, Julie?
Well, because he had to give restrictions.
Okay.
That if he doesn't, and go back to verses 2, it says, that she may leave the ears of grain after the husband's son, I like my faith. So I have to really get the open like you.
Right. Right, yeah. She had to go out, and it doesn't seem like she knew where she was going. She just went to a field and was hoping that she wouldn't get run off. And she, by sheer luck, ends up at Boaz's field. Yeah, I think God is in action here. This is the exact right place to be for her. And we'll preview, what does Naomi say when she finds out where she's been gleaning? What's her reaction? It's later in chapter 2 when she comes back and she's got an ephod of barley. How much is an ephod? Julie, last time you collected an ephod, how much was that? So so she works all day. This is the first day. She works all day. She shakes out all the chaff, and she has left over the barley. It's an ephod. Okay, so it's about 7.5 gallons of barley which is 30-something pounds. It's a lot for a person to pick up loose stuff. So she's doing way better than probably you ever would have expected as a gleaner. And then she also has leftover lunch to share with Naomi when she gets back. She was served lunch and she didn't eat it all. And then so she tells Naomi where she was, and you can kind of, as you read this, see the gears start to turn in Naomi's head when she hears it's Boaz she's been working under. How did he know? How did he know who she was? How does Boaz know anything about her? Her reputation. This is apparently, Bethlehem's a small town, and people talk. Naomi came back, and the story spreads. This is kind of gossip. What? Yeah, but it seems like the whole community here knows about what's been going on. So what I want to look at in these questions we're about to answer is Ruth is influencing Boaz already, although they hadn't fully met. And that's a big takeaway for us today, that we can be influential because her actions changed his actions, even though they had no contact previously. So let's look at that. So this is the page we put a 2 over this column. What's the relationship between the influenced individual? Okay, that's right. There's strangers. I mean, he's heard of her. She's not heard of him, and they've never met. Okay. So was it long-term or short-term? You can put short-term, you can put none because they didn't have one. What's the overall result of Ruth's influence on Boaz to this point? Positive. Okay. He seems to have been a fair and generous man, but it seems like he's going further into that based on what he's heard about Ruth. He's being even more generous. It's, I'd say, very positive influence. What's the method of influence? How did she influence him? Okay, she was taking care of Naomi, and he's heard about it. That's right. The word had spread about her actions, and it's influenced probably a lot of people in town, but certainly Boaz. What's the impact of the influence? How does it change him? Yeah, he's protecting Ruth, and he's going to be very generous to her, far and above what was required by the law. And he's doing all these extra things. He's giving her food. He's letting her collect in the fields. He's protecting her in a situation that really, for a young woman to be out and about, was very dangerous at this time. And yet, so he's providing that protection as she works. Was the influence a result of a conscious effort? Clearly not here. She had not intended to influence Boaz, and yet she had done that. Was it part of a larger pattern? Not yet. This is very isolated so far. Was he aware of the influence she was exerting on him? No, he's not aware. It wasn't in the intention to influence him, so there's not anything to be aware of. It's just happening. Would Boaz have been better off or worse off without the influence? It seems to me that he's becoming more generous, a better man, just based on what he's heard about Ruth and Naomi. It's already starting to be a benefit to him, just based on having heard about her. So that's true. That's true. The servants are seeing him react, and I'm sure that's impactful for them as well. That's true. Okay, here's some speculation. What would have been the result of the situation without the influence? What if he had heard nothing of Ruth, and so there's no influence there? How would he have acted differently? Okay. Nikki says perhaps prevented her from gleaning in his fields. Anything else?
Well, we don't know what kind of man he was prior to Judah, but afterwards he was upright, he was seemed to be a good guy. So whether he would have thrown her out of his field because she was around, I don't know.
Yeah.
But he seemed to be a good person.
Yeah, he does. And we see even in the greeting, when he comes to the fields to check on his harvesters, his greeting to his servants, it's all about God. And their response to him is about God. I mean, he's the godly man who's focused on what God is doing for him. And he seems to be building on his good character by going out of his way. Absolutely, he does. He wouldn't normally have told her, if he was going to let her glean, just drink the water my servants are drawing, and come sit and eat the meals with my servants. Pull out. Yeah, that's right. No. I'm sure he would have allowed it to continue the gleaning, but it would have been just, hey, she's going to do this, leave her alone, and that would have been it. So, okay. So what are some takeaways from this bit of influence?
It pays to have a good reputation.
Okay, pays to have a good reputation, right? And a good word. Okay. Yeah, and Ruth here is gathering for not just herself, but for Naomi. And so we're going to see she really works at this, and that's also influential.
Also, saying that we don't always know when we're influencing people around us. Because she had no idea.
Right.
She was just doing what she needed to do.
Yep.
People around us.
Yeah, that's a big one, I think, is that we don't always know the impact of our influence. And here's a good example of that. She was influencing based on her actions. She had no idea how influential she was being. Okay. Let's go over to the next column. Go back a page to Naomi and Ruth. This is the column I had you put a 3 on top of. And so chapter 3, this is when Naomi starts to exert her influence in a more focused way here with Ruth. Verses 1 through 5. Then Naomi, her daughter-in-law, said to her, her mother-in-law said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? And now is not Boaz our kinsman with those maids you were? Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight. Wash yourself, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And it shall be, when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do." And she said to her, "All that you say, I will do." Okay. So in this instance, Naomi has this plan now to secure a future for Ruth. Julie? Well, can it be the same? I mean,
Well, how does Naomi know that he's going to tell her something and it's going to be what she wants?
so Naomi, we don't know that she knows how this is going to play out, right? And yet, Ruth is willing to do it anyway. So that's part of what I wanted us to notice here. This is not necessarily going to go well, and yet there was so much trust between Ruth and Naomi. Ruth does this and really stepping out on a limb here, and this could go well, but it could also not turn out too well. But that's how much influence Naomi has. Rob?
When she first came back, she said, Lord, reader, and all.
Mm-hmm.
Because she wanted to do something. But now she knows this. Boaz is great. He saw Ruth in the field, and I'm sure he needed to be complicated.
Right. Did he have to marry her, though? I mean, it's part of this duty. Only if he wanted the land, only if he wanted the inheritance that belonged to Naomi's husband, Elimelech or whatever his name was, then he would have to marry. Uh, right. So there's a closer kinsman, turns out, closer than even Boaz. And so Boaz is going to have this conversation. If you want this inheritance, you want this, not inheritance, if you want this land, you have to take Ruth as well. And the other guy swore it off.
It looks like too that there's some sort of traditions
Yes.
that Naomi's aware of,
Uh-huh.
and how to go about
Right.
capturing.
Would Ruth have known these little customs? Probably not. No.
But Naomi does.
Yeah. Right.
And I think that's part of the reason why Naomi knows, okay, what's getting ready to happen. When you do this is what's going to happen.
Okay.
This is what's going to
Okay.
Because it's part of the custom.
It is. It was part of a custom, and it meant something to Boaz when it played out. But it was that's a really big thing to ask of somebody to go and do this, and yet Ruth does it exactly as Naomi has told her. So I want to look at that real quick before we run out of time. So this is the second column on the page for Ruth and Naomi. We'll skip over the relationship stuff. What was the method? How did she influence? How did she exert her influence here? Yeah, she's just giving her some advice or some instructions. It's very upfront. What's the impact going to be? Yeah, it's going to end up with a marriage. Was it a conscious effort by Naomi to convince Ruth? Clearly, it was here. It was a pattern. We can just answer that one. We know already there's been a pattern established of influence between these two. And Ruth was aware. Now, would Ruth have been better off or worse off without the influence? Clearly, she'd be worse without it. But at the time, she doesn't know how this is going to play out. This is a scary thing to do. Speculation, what would have been the result without the influence? What if Naomi never made this suggestion to Ruth? Long term? She may still continue to gather food for them, but there's never going to be any kind of final remedy for this poverty situation that they're in. So this is it's going to be a big change. And that's speculation as to how this plays out. Perhaps she would have married somebody eventually. Perhaps eventually Boaz would have taken action on his own. We don't really know. But this is Naomi taking the bull by the horns. Okay, and so then let's jump ahead to Boaz, his reaction. So this is the found in chapter 3, 6 through 13, because we are about 2 minutes. So she went to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law had commanded her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of the grain. And she came secretly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And it happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and bent forward, and beheld, a woman was lying at his feet. And he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative." Then he said, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask, for all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence." Okay, so we'll stop it right there. He's obviously startled and surprised when he finds her there. He didn't seem to anticipate this kind of move by Ruth. And he promises to do whatever she asks. And he says all his people know she's a woman of excellence. So what he has to do next, as a result of this, he has to go have a very awkward conversation with this other man who's the closer kin to Naomi than he is. And he has to do it in a very public setting and there's the customs of the time to go through. But it's really, you think about what you're asking him to do, he can't just marry her. There's this process that has to play out. And he could look really foolish if it doesn't go well. There's probably some bit of pride, I think, in putting yourself out there, Boaz, proposing, I'm going to marry this woman, and you're an older man. What that's creepy. Why are you going to marry this young woman? Or, what's your motive here? But his motive is she's a woman of excellence, and he feels like, this is something worthwhile for him to pursue. So it's not a simple thing that she's asking him to do, and he is going to go forward. And he gets back. Well, when Ruth gets back in the morning, Naomi says, "Okay, we have to watch and see what's going to happen. He's not going to let the sun go down until he's resolved this." She knows he's going to go about and get it done. So the last column, we have 1 minute probably. What's the relationship between the two? No longer strangers, just acquaintances at this point. We don't know that much has changed about them in this amount of time. Overall results of this, positive or negative? And what's her method of influencing Boaz here? Just your standard uncovering some man's feet in the middle of the night. Okay, her actions, but she also makes a request. Okay, well, we're out of time. Let's skip ahead. A takeaway from this. Listen to what? Listen to your mother-in-law, right? Yeah, that's true. But it's another example of how influential she had become just through her actions, right? She's now a woman of excellence, and the whole town knows it. So he's willing to go forward with this. Sandy? Yep. Find. Yep. That's true. Excellent. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. Next week we'll do Michael. Okay. In this lesson.